So welcome everyone to Tending the Witch Wound, a journey to release, restore, reclaim, and reweave our world from the inside out. Today, I have the honor of speaking with Max Dashu. And I came across Max Dashu a couple years ago, shortly before her book, Witches and Pagans, came out. One of my mentors sent me a podcast and told me that I needed to know about Max. And as soon as I discovered her, listening to the podcast and then reading the book, I had multiple moments where I teared up. It's that moment when my soul recognized that there was truth to be had. And so I have since basically listened to as many podcasts and gotten my hands on as much material as I can from Max. And I couldn't teach a class called Tending the Witch Wound without inviting Max to come speak. So with that, I want to turn it over to her to introduce herself in her own words. So Max, who are you? And tell us what you want us to know about you.
Okay, well, right as we speak this month, well, next month actually, in October will be 49 years that I have been doing global women's history through the Suppressed Histories Archives. And I'm an independent scholar, so I'm kind of a library prospector. And the focus of my research is, where are the women in culture and history and the whole cultural record? And so I started out looking for matricultures, societies where women were free, where you did not have a patriarchal system or any other system of domination. And so that was my starting point. As I went along, I really became aware of the degree to which female spheres of power are in the spiritual realms. So the priestesses, witches, wise women, medicine women, female shamans, that whole spectrum. And so there are certain patterns that once you start really looking into the cultural record, that's what you begin to see. And then I began writing this book that I just put out, my first book, Witches and Pagans, Women in European Folk Religion. And it's looking at a slice of time, because this is actually part of a whole series, Secret History of the Witches. So there's actually 16 volumes. This is just volume 7. And I'm working on volume 2 now, which will be about Greece in the Hellenic world. And what about the Pythias, the snake women of Delphi? What about the prophetic women and the bee women, the Pythias and the Melissae? That's the name of the book. And also making DVDs. Just my approach really has to do a lot with the visual, because our history or our cultural heritage isn't just what men wrote. It is actually the baskets with the sacred signs woven into them. It's the painted pottery that shows the women dancing together in ceremony. There's a whole lot much more out there of rock art, and that's a very global cultural record, unlike what we're usually fed. So you really get full representation from Africa, the Americas, the Pacific Islands, Northern Asia, not just Eastern or Southern Asia, you know. And so that is really decolonizing history, a way of like overturning a lot of the assumptions and scripts that we've been fed, and looking more at, well, what happened in all these places, all these lands? You know, what was the melody? What was the flavor of the culture? And what was it like for women in those places? You know, places we never ever are taught about, like Tanzania or Sumatra or Colombia, you know, before the conquest, the Great Lakes peoples. And so, you know, I've been trying to document that, and I've been trying to make it accessible, because a lot of this material is just buried. It's either in obscure ethnographic studies that are really biased on top of everything else, or else it is, it's in really specialized journals. And so you don't run across the stories of the foundational medicine women in Zimbabwe, or, you know, liberating female warriors in the resistance against the conquests. And so I'm trying to pull it out and make it visible so we can know about it, because it gives us another sense of who we are and who we can be, whatever our ancestral background is.
Thank you, Max. I want to just dive right in, because I want you just to riff as much as you can here. You know, first question, how do you relate to the word witch? What does witch mean? Who are the witches
Yeah.
historically?
Hmm. I like the word witch. It's a good word. It's an old word. This is Anglo-Saxon, you know, and witche, spelled different ways, WYCCE, various forms of it. And so the scholarship, I really delved into this. I started researching it in the early 70s, and the scholarship is all over the map about this. And I talk about the etymology of the name itself in English in my book, Witches and Pagans. And so there are three different theories. One has to do with a root in Old Indo-European that means to bend or to twine. Another, a root that has to do with making sacred. And then a third root, which is like, we still have this word witch, like in English place names, Sandwich or Warwick. It means a living, it has to do with living, whether it's a living place in those cases, or whether it has to do with, like the phrase, the quick and the dead is that same root, quick, wick. It means to have vital power in it. And actually, maybe the three definitions I just gave you are, in a way, a constellation that can actually focus us. And we don't even have to necessarily know, because no one really does for sure, what the final consensus will be about that. Maybe we'll find out more information sometime. But the sacred, the vital life principle, and the ability to bend reality according to the spirit, according to the intention of the spirit, all of those work. And so that's the etymology of the name. And in my book, I talk a lot in chapter 3, Names of the Witch, about this very question, because of course, witch is an English word, and it really changes meaning when you transport it, because that word was brought to North America, and you had not only the hunts at Salem. A lot of people don't know the worst witch hunts in the US colonies were in Connecticut, and they happened as far south as the Carolinas, and not necessarily, I mean, they were hanging, the English were hanging women for witchcraft, and not everybody was hanged in those colonies, but you still had the old accusations from Europe had been brought over. So, but if we look at the rest of the world, I mean, we're looking again at a group of names which have much more to do with healers, with prophecy, with seership, the dreaming reality, the transformation of reality, the interpretation of ancestral messages, of connection with land spirits. And so that's very congruent with what we see in Europe before we have this process of Christianization that changes the old ethnic cultures, and their ancestral wisdom ways. So it's, for example, like, in the Southwest of what's now the United States, this word witch, adopted, because it was brought as a colonial word, comes in with a negative demonized meaning, which it had acquired in Europe. And so Native people here had never seen that word used in any other way. So you will see it used as harmful sorcerer of some kind. But there is also, I've found over and over again, indigenous people tend to recognize that the witch hunts, very explicitly in some cases, the European witch hunts led us to this really toxic, unbalanced culture that we're all suffering under now, and which has really been, it has taken hold in a global way, this culture of domination and disconnection from Mother Nature. So they see that. They see very well that the witches were the medicine people. And a lot of times that I've seen that expressed, for example, when they had the 500th anniversary of 1492 in the conquest, that was being put out by speakers in San Francisco. There was a series of events called the Chasqui that Native people put on in order to commemorate half a millennium of colonization, and the impact of that. And so they were talking about that, at some of those gatherings. So the name, there's many angles, and I think that one of the things we have to look at with what happened to the concept of witch in European history is you have not just Christianization, but a whole development of persecution that happened through the early Middle Ages, and not just burning at the stake, but a whole range of really literally wounds in some cases, You know, I mean, it's very interesting that this is called the witch wound. And I asked you about that because there are literal inflictions of wounds in the process of these persecutions. You know, so we're looking at the hounding of women. I mean, I'm not saying that it was only ever women, but women were the primary targets, you know, over a long swath of time. And so physical assault, things thrown, names and insults hurled, intimidation, menacing, pushing. And then there's a Scottish expression from early modern times, scoring aboon the breath. And so it means to score is to draw a line. It's to cut in this case, above the breath. So aboon the breath, it's like usually the forehead or the cheeks. And the attacker, usually a man, would take a knife and he would cut a line and often try to cut a whole cross onto her forehead and make her bleed. And her shedding of blood betokened that this spell which she had supposedly cast in order to harm her accuser was now broken. So it had to be broken with violence, and her blood had to be forcibly shed for him and the community who watched while this went on and tacitly or even openly supported it in order that, you know, his affliction would pass away. So there's an aspect of scapegoating that I see as fundamental to the witch's wound. It's taking a marginalized person who is both powerless enough to be attacked and vilified and defamed and publicly dishonored in those ways, but also seen as so powerful that she is causing all this harm. You know, so the sick animals or the baby that died or the man broke his leg, drunkenly coming home one night from the tavern, whatever it may be, whatever misfortune, can be laid at her door. And she does not have the public credibility or power, that's really about power, to have her perspective be seen or heard. She cannot actually be heard, and her speech is not valid. She is ritualized, in a ritualized manner, cast out. And so this is something that's done in public, in the presence of a group, you know, most often. I mean, there are cases I mean, I can talk about this more. I just printed some stuff out because there's some accounts of this happening, and that could give you a little more flavor if you want it of how that goes on. But, you know, this to me is really quintessentially the witch wound, because it's literally wounding the witch, you know, and the injury that inflicts on her physically, on her body, but also on her psyche, that it's not just the pain of having a knife slice open your face, but to have everyone around, you know, cheering it on and othering you ever more inexorably, you know, really casting you out in a very visceral way. That's a deeper wound than what happens to the body. That's a psychic wound. And we have that, I think, really embedded in European culture, Euro-American culture, all these colonial cultures that have gone out, because it's a fundamental part of the social order, this ritual disempowerment of women, you know, and silencing of women.
Yeah, Max, thank you so much. I want you to just frame up for the students some of the historical timeline here around, you know, numbers, how many women were killed during the European witch hunts, like how did that predate and kind of overlap with the Age of Enlightenment and the Age of Discovery and all of that? Like, can you just paint that arc so that the students really have an understanding of how severe this was over time and in terms of numbers of people?
Yeah, as far as numbers, that's easy. Nobody knows. There's this huge range of estimates that diverge by hundreds of thousands. That's how completely uncountable this is. A lot of the standard position in academia has been, well, you know, there weren't really very many because it was really only concentrated between, then their numbers will vary, but usually they'll say between 1500 and 1650, you know, or they'll say maybe a period of 250 years. But this went on for over a millennia. You know, you have to count in the whole range, and you asked about that. So first we can see already that burnings are happening in Greek and Roman times. And the documentation for that is very thin. It's very accidental and marginal. It comes up only because some other matter that was considered important, like some man's property, some legal case over property, there will be a sidebar about a witch trial that is not otherwise extant in any written sources, and referred to as a matter of known fact, that you torture them, so that's going on. And the Roman Empire was burning at the stake, not only for witchcraft, but also for heresy, also for a variety of things, including, we get into a certain amount of other social dominations that are going on, But okay, so Rome falls, and then we have the early Middle Ages. And this is a very murky period historically. We see reference to burnings. It's scattered. It's mostly in the chronicles, but it does occur in some of the law codes. And what we have to understand about that early medieval period is that there were no regular judicial records kept the way that we have now. And that situation continued in some countries up until the 1200s, 13, 14, 1500s, even later. We have archives that have been destroyed, and there's reference to this there's a French historian of the witch hunts, Robert Mandrou, and he talks about how entire provincial governments in southern France officially destroyed their archives before a certain year because they were trying to hide from the crown, from the central royal government, the witch hunts that had been going on. This is in the 1600s, So those are gone. Those records are gone. There's no way to count that. And then you have also the fact that the hunts extend longer, maybe start later, but also go on later in Eastern Europe. So places like Poland and Hungary, Estonia, Scandinavia are later, and it's not even across Europe, because in the Orthodox countries, there's not nearly as much persecution as there is in Western Europe under first the Catholic Church and then also the Protestants. So in terms of putting your timing, there's this whole complex process, and I'll be talking about that more in future volumes. I mean, it's not something you can render simply. Like a lot of times people say, well, the witch hunts happened because there was ergot in the rye that people were eating, and it's a precursor to LSD, and they were all going crazy and, making things up. And someone else says, no, it was the conflict between the Protestants and Catholics, and this is the reason for the witch hunts. And someone else says, no, it's capitalism, but there's a very strong underlying sexual politics to these persecutions. The targets are quintessentially and stereotypically female. And so in the 800s, the 900s, you start to see more examples coming into either laws or chronicles of women being burned at the stake. And then the magistrates of the newfound cities in the late Middle Ages begin making witch hunting laws. And they're not always burning at the stake. They could be, again, the wound, they could be branding her. They can fine her. They could confiscate her property if she had any, or they could exile her. And that could be a death sentence right there, to be a woman sent out on the roads alone. What happens to you then? So drowning, imprisonment, lots of other punishments. But anyway, when we get up to the edge of the colonial period, all of the ideology that had been forged in the process of the Inquisition and the torture trials that they reintroduced from Greco-Roman times, and then the secular witch trials that copied the ideology of those the demonologies of the inquisitorial witch trials, all of that had ravaged Europe already at the point where you have Europe going out to conquer the rest of the world. And so they are exporting these colonials, these same repressive ideologies, including the concept of devil worship, that anyone who does not follow not just Christianity, but the church authorities, it must be a devil worshiper, And so then all of the Americas, all of Africa, Philippines, all these places are dismissed. Their entire cultural wealth and wisdom is persecuted, repressed as devil worship. So there's a definite relationship between the persecution primarily of women and also of this really archaic in a good sense, folk culture, the ethnic cultures of Europe. But it is related very much to what is going on in the colonization of North America, in the transatlantic slave trade, and all of these things that we know of. You know, there's a relationship, and sometimes you can draw a really direct relationship. So, for example, Juan de Zumarraga in the Basque Country in the 1520s is burning women at the stake as witches. He gets sent to Mexico, becomes Bishop of Mexico City, and in that capacity is burning Aztecs at the stake for devil worship. And he's also burning books. So all these precious codices of the Aztec astronomy and, you know, their spiritual traditions, their calendars, all of that is demolished in the fires. Like the book burnings that had gone on and were still going on in Europe. You know, lots of through lines there. And anyway, just to complete it, so, you know, we can't really give any true number, but it is clear that we're looking at more than those who were actually burned being affected. We're seeing that girls were made to conform to cultural, really oppressive cultural norms, but in their mother's fear that they too would be caught up. We're seeing people who are relatives of the women who were accused being caught up in the hunts. There's all these dynamics going on. And so this really branded Europe, really seared into people's social relations, their spiritual traditions, or rather the excision of those, you know, seared away connections that had existed before, and really stained our sexuality, the way that bodies are regarded, you know, embodiment, ceremonies that had once honored the body being declared devilish, and, you know, things around birth and midwifery, for example, being big targets. Even when they were practicing Catholic prayer, you have these old Italian women, or not necessarily old women, but herbalists and midwives who were applying ointments of olive oil combined with flowers that was prepared in a consecrated way. So they might actually be saying Hail Marys over them, but this was still regarded as witchcraft and persecuted by witch hunters, you know, and they tried to force them into repeating these demonological pornographies, you know, the fantasies of the inquisitors and the torturers. You know, the torture would not stop until you had either given in or died, you know. And those torture trials too were ritual of domination, you know, of domination and submission. So you have in Italy, you have inquisitors barking at the women, say it, say that you were a witch and went with the devil, you know, say that you had sex with the devil, whatever it was that they, you know, and a lot of this involved devil sex fantasies, you know, with the painful ice cold member of the demon, you know. So there's this is something that leaked out into the culture, you know. It's why whips and dungeons and torture became associated with sexuality in Euro-American or European consciousness, you know, that we have to look at all of this because culture is magnetic, you know, and the things that happen, and you were talking before about epigenetics, things that happen to us or to our ancestors become magnetized in our cellular memory, you know, so that it causes things to happen, things that follow along, you know. And I think that there's a huge degree to which we're not conscious of how that's happened to us, you know. And people talk, and this is not only true in the European tradition, of course, I mean, people talk about post-slavery traumatic syndrome, you know, because of any people who undergo over long periods of time systemic violence and violation and humiliation and oppression. It's going to go down through the generations, you know, especially if the conditions only morph. They don't really go away. They just change shape, you know. So instead of slavery Officially, you have slavery by prison system, you know. So that's all still talking about the wound, you know, the witch's wound. And on the positive side, there's that beauty, that wounded beauty of who we really are, our actual nature, that has been imprinted, impressed, crushed into the shapes, you know, the ways our bodies are held in under stress and under pressure, and the trauma that's embedded, whether generationally or just within our own lifetime, you know, that acts upon us. But under that is, you know, they talk about what is your original face before birth. And, you know, this is a Chinese saying, kind of a mixture of Taoism and Buddhism. You know, who were you? Who are you before the things that happened to you, before your individual history, you know? But even that history, there's like this process of excavation of nectar that we can do as we recover. You know, we go back in and find things and recognize and remember things that are just basically different than the culture we're living under now. You know, all these beautiful things. I was looking through, I was trying to find the source about this, e dirlo in Italian, say it, you know, trying to force the woman to his will and get her to say what he wanted her to say. And so I'm flipping through a chapter that's in the volume about the 1500s, going into the 1600s. And there was a whole section there of beautiful things from a book by Alexander Carmichael, a Scot, who wrote a book called Carmina Gadelica. So it means the Gaelic song in Latin, right? And he's really all about recovering these old Highland and these old folk traditions of Scotland. And there are these beautiful stories about midwives and the ways that they would consecrate the child after the birth. You know, and there's a lot of things that are very widespread, like the ritual bathing of the child, the ritual walking of the child around the fire, maybe the touching of the child to the earth. But in this example, the midwife is taking probably consecrated water, might have been gathered, as was traditional for a lot of ceremonies, from a south running spring. But anyway, she dips her hand in the water and she touches 3 times to the forehead of the child. And she's probably saying some charm. And by that time, you know, that this was written, it was almost certainly a Christianized tradition. But I know this went back before Christianity had come to the Highlands. And so she does this dipping, and then sometimes there will be a woman or a group of women singing these hauntingly beautiful melodies to welcome the child. And one of them, I don't have it in front of me, so I can't quote it unless we take a break, but it has the women singing the blessings of the 9 waves to the child. So let the blessing of this wave be to you, and let the blessing of that wave be to you. And they name each attribute that they're giving to the child for their health or for whatever aspect of life that they're blessing. And the number 9 is so charged. And this is some of the nectar for us, because not just in European folk tradition, but we can see this in Africa and China, a lot of different places, you know, that the 9 is it's the number of it's the whole, it's the full measure before you roll over and start again with 1 0. And so the 9 is really important in European folk charms, which I would call witch charms. You know, even if they've been Christianized, this is the archaic mode of culture. It predates the church in Europe. And so they're singing to the 9 sisters who lived in the elder tree, who lived in boar tree, is the Old English form of that. And the elder, of course, is a very magical tree. Or they're singing out to 9 sisters who live out on the island of Buyan in some of the Russian charms. And a lot of these are healing charms. So charm, of course, meaning a song, coming from Latin carmen. So, you know, we have, this shows you what happens with language and culture. For us, charm, it's become a charming woman. You know, oh, that's charming. You know, it's kind of like almost become satirical. But originally, charming meant to sing spirit into something in order to bring about a desired result. So it could be a love charm, but it could be a healing charm. And it's a magical song. It's a chant. There's a lot of that nectar that we can look at.
Thank you, Max. I'm curious if you can expand that a little bit more around, I know you have this phrase in your Witches and Pagans book, and I might get it wrong, but the Sa Wiccan Techeth, like as the witches teach.
Oh yeah, yeah. Swa Wiccan Techeth.
Yeah, and so how are these, you know, like the Hammer of Witches or the okay, I'm gonna get it wrong.
Yeah. Malleus Maleficarum.
Thank you. Yeah, how are these, you know, that document, for instance, was kind of basically a really sadistic, here, go out and kill all of these women document, but yet it preserved some of the ethnic practices that were happening. Can you talk a little bit about how, you know, some of those nectar items that you're talking about have been preserved by the oppressor, colonialists, etc.?
Yeah, yeah. They became embedded in sets of laws or texts which were intended to persecute and stamp out that which they were chasing after. And in the process of attempting to eradicate it, for us, they preserved shreds of evidence about what it looked like. It isn't the direct transmission anymore, but there's these pieces. And so, you know, I've been gathering together these pieces, trying to weave together some sense of how it all fit together. So, for example, in the Malleus Maleficarum, this is from German witch inquisitors in the late 1400s, just for the time context. Inquisition has already been going on after witches for a couple hundred years by that time. They target midwives. And they say, which midwives commit most horrid crimes when they dedicate children to devils in most accursed wise? So they're the same kind of ceremonies I just described to you from the Scottish context here in Germany are being described as devil worship. You know, anything that is not done by the priest is bad and is suspect, especially when done by women. And this is a world that women kept away from the view of the priest. They would do it secretly. Nevertheless, the priesthood came to know about it. And so here's Kramer and Sprenger saying, well, you know, they're offering children to devils. So if we unpack that, we can see that they are making a sacred ceremony of consecrating the child's life, you know, including sometimes naming the child, which the priest really wanted to arrogate that to himself through baptism. But he's saying, well, no, this is not being done for any sacred purpose. This is being done to offer the child to devils, because the women sometimes, there's evidence for this in Scandinavia, for example, where women were still praying to Freya around births, or to Frigg, and they would name those goddesses, and so that would be two devils as far as the priesthood was concerned, right? But and that was the one you asked about before, and I just loved it, because when I found this, I mean, it's just like one of the most precious fragments. There were a series of priestly manuals that were intended to interrogate the common people to find out if they were doing any forbidden practices that the priesthood didn't like. So these are called penitential books, and there's a lot of them from many different countries in Western Europe. And they're basically catalogs of folk custom. You know, so over and over again, you will see them talk about people making offerings beside wells, or going to stones and touching the stones, or trees, and sometimes all three together. And so these are sanctuaries, they're nature sanctuaries. And we have a very reliable documentation that this kind of reverence, land reverence, is being practiced. It's earth-based spirituality that they're documenting for us, but it's all rah, 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 don't do this. And so one of the texts is in Latin from France in the late 800s. And it's translated a couple centuries later by an Anglo-Saxon monk. And so he translates the passage accurately, but he adds one little parenthetical piece to it. And so the gist of it is, well, you know, we really disapprove of you who go out to stones and springs and trees and make offerings. You know, this is wrong, you shouldn't do it. But the Anglo-Saxon monk adds, as witches do. Those witches teach. Let me find the passage. I gotta just, let me give it to you straight. It's important because, it's just more, it has more. Yeah, this is Halit Gar of Cambrai. That's the original source. And so they bring their offerings to earth-fast stone. I love that. Earth-fast stone, so it's a deep boulder embedded in the earth. And also to trees and to well springs. And according to him, will not understand how stupidly they act, or how this dead stone or that dumb tree might help them or give them health, when these things themselves are never able to move from their place. So this is pretty standard priestly boilerplate. But in the 11th century England, we've got the translator adding context with this phrase, Swa Wiccan tacheth, as the witches teach. So he's telling us two things just with those three words. He's telling us that witches are seen as teachers, as spiritual authorities, and he's also saying that what they teach is this reverence for earth, for water. It's water is life, but in a medieval European context. So I just love that because it's so rare. Later on, you never get this kind of acknowledgement from the priestly writers or from anybody else writing in, the literate class of men, that this is something sacred, because it all has to be recast and redefined as devil worship. And so much of what we're dealing with now is who has the authority to interpret. Women don't have the authority to interpret, nor to speak, nor to name, according to the dominant culture. We've been fighting our way back up from a very thrown down place, so, and that's been true also along the axis of racial oppression, the colonial axis. Native peoples were dismissed as ignorant and superstitious, and so much that could have been known, to the world was destroyed through this systemic destruction, basically. And, the process of cultural genocide through the boarding schools, the stolen generations being taken away, forbidden and punished from speaking their own language. And so there was a rupture of transmission of this cultural stream that's supposed to flow from generation to generation. And in spite of the academic idea that oral tradition is somehow not reliable, that it's not really good evidence for anything, it has been proven by some academics that there are very long memories that can be sustained, things that we see authenticated from other historical sources. Like, for example, in the Bible, there are names of rulers, Egyptian rulers, that we can actually correlate with actual Egyptian rulers, and so, we have to be able to look at all this and kind of sort through it, sift through it in order to evaluate, well, we know this is bogus because this is completely ideological. And we see that these other aspects of the culture they're describing are very different. And they say this, so there's a lot of that we have to do. But the cultural record is really complex. So we have to look at these very biased sources. They are the source that we have for what was going on in the early Middle Ages, for example. And it can be supplemented by the visual record, like the sculptures in the Romanesque churches are very interesting because you have the Sheela-na-gigs and a celebration of, women's power of sexuality and birth that was so still present in the common culture that the stonemasons, would put it over church windows and doors and in passageways. So there you get another view. So another thing that I talk about in Witches and Pagans is this pattern I discovered of in the Gospels of the ruling class. There were ivory book covers or there were illuminated manuscripts, and not at the center, but along the margins, you would see Mother Earth as a woman, often suckling children at her breasts or snakes at her breasts. She would be often sitting under a tree. And sometimes greenery or other plants were growing all around her. So this theme made its way even into Christian elite sources. Imagine how much stronger it would have been inside the folk culture itself, because it was really the aristocracy that was imposing this from above and supporting the church as against the folk paganism or the heathens. So that theme of Earth Mother with the snake at her breast as the one who nurtures all living beings is also continuing along in church sculpture, but it changes because now she's renamed. She's not Earth anymore. She's called Luxuria, which, like the word luxury, but in Latin it means sensuality. It's a sexual reference. A woman, Temptress Eve, is basically the overlay that's put over the old Earth Mother. And she still has the snakes at her breasts, but increasingly over time, from say the year 1000, over the next couple centuries, instead of gratefully sucking nurturance from her breast, the snake is now gnawing on her breast. He's chewing her breast. And she's in agony because she has to be shown to suffer from sin, because luxuria is one of the 7 deadly sins. So you can see how even the sacred traditions get torqued, and this distortion then sends really, really different message, and very anti-woman, very anti-body, anti-earth, the anti-snake. I mean, the terror, the horror of snakes, which have so much to do in a global context with healing and transformation and birth and rebirth and ancestral beings and just so many different meanings. The flow of life force, the flow of rivers, all of that snake symbolism, even just with the river in our body. If you want to talk about Kundalini, that's imagined as it's the double helix. It's an intertwining spiral going up the spine. So the spine is a tree of life encircled by snakes. And you can find a lot of global correlates for that.
Max, can you flesh out just the evidence for mother right culture, since you were kind of going into that, just to give you some time to talk about mother right culture, matrilineal culture, and then the rise of the patriarchy, just generally?
Yeah. Well, first I have to say there's no one timeline, because the biggest question I get is, well, when did all this happen? And you can only answer that by saying, where on the planet are you talking about? Because the timeline for the Mediterranean or for parts of Europe and Southwest Asia is very different, the Bronze Age or even before, going back into the Neolithic in those parts of the world. But then if you are in Sumatra, you don't have, even now, like the Minangkabau people have retained a matrilineal system. They converted to Islam. And so, that's officially a patrilineal system, but they have managed to hold on to this. And their culture, Peggy Sanday has documented this really well in her book, Women at the Center, which is about the matriarchal culture of Western Sumatra. And she talks about how their culture hero is a first woman. It's not a male hero. It's an ancestral female founder, Bundu Kanduong. And the pillar of the longhouse where these people still live, in these collective longhouses, matrilineal, matrilocal society, men come to live with their wives in these houses. The pillar that upholds the house is named Bundu Kanduang, after the ancestral woman. She is literally the foundation. So that is a really different feeling to see a culture, because we're so used to everything being structured around what men have done and said and built. And this is a society, the actual name that they give for their social system is Adat Ibu, which means the law of the mother. And so mother law, we can see in a lot of parts of the world. Working on the book I'm doing now on Pythias and Melissae in the Hellenic world, if you go back into the Neolithic in Europe, you see abundant evidence of female-centered cultural expression, and a lot of this because it was being made by women. It didn't mean that men had no rights or no power, but you see a lot of really beautiful culture being created by women, creating clay figurines and these gorgeous ceramics that are all inscribed or painted with spirals that were part of their ceremonial culture, and the offerings that they laid with the dead, but also certainly things that they would have done in ceremonies for the living, through the whole life cycle. So we have all of these incredible archaeological remnants of cultures all over the world that look a lot like each other in certain ways, like the spiral painted water pots or seed pots maybe is one example. In China, in India, in the Balkans, in Iran, in northeastern Africa. In later periods, you see it also in places like Cameroon, Nigeria. So there are these themes shared among cultures that have a focus on the ancestral mother as the foundation of life. And the idea that because the children are born of the mother and you don't really know who the father is, and so matricultural societies, it's not that they are depriving men, they are simply not policing women's sexuality in order to ensure fatherhood. And the mother line is the most stable social system in this sense. You know who your kin are. Everybody saw her carry that child, bear that child, and those women and children never become homeless. Because if the marriage breaks up, which often happens, this is humanity after all, he goes back to his kin. The children remain with their kin, and he can come back and visit them, but it's stable. And it means that the woman being among her kin cannot be raped, cannot be beaten, whereas if she's sent out as a stranger in a patriarchal society, she has no natural allies around her, and she comes in underneath everybody else in the family, and she has no natural defenders. So mother-in-law, I like the phrase because we get stuck with a lot of the anthropological language, and these battles over, was there ever matriarchy? No, there was not. There could not have been. All societies from the beginning of time were male dominated, and this was the doctrine that, well, I mean, it's still around, but it was very much in the driver's seat when I was in college. You really couldn't say that other social systems were not only possible, but have existed and still exist, because we have living cultures. The Haudenosaunee, Six Nations of the Iroquois, the Pueblo peoples in Arizona and New Mexico. Many, many examples throughout the Americas. A lot of these are just not well known. That huge chunks of Alaska and the whole western coast of Canada were matrilineal, going down through into the peoples of the upper Missouri River, the Mandan and the Hidatsa. I mean, this is you're right there in Minnesota, and it's just like, this is getting very close to the country that you and I both grew up around. And the Wichita, I mean, there are names we only know as a place name, a city in Kansas, right? But in the Southern Plains, the Wichita people were matrilineal and matrilocal. So they had a social structure that was like a support system for life, that the mother and child would be supported, that it's because of the physical fact of women giving birth. It's for no other reason. It doesn't mean that women are better or that men can't have gifts or contribute. And it's really important to look at what men look like in those truly egalitarian cultures. For example, in the Iroquois nations, there's a wonderful historian, Barbara Alice Mann, who wrote a book called Iroquoian Women, the Gantowisas. And she documents how men aspired to be like mothers. And they would even talk about a chief. The way that a chief would be praised would be, he has big breasts and they give good milk. Because the idea was that a chief should be a giver. He should not be someone who accumulates wealth and power to himself, but he is an agent for the councils of the elders, both the male elders and the Gantowisas, the female elders, who have such structural veto power, in the society over going to war, over all kinds of matters, diplomatic matters. They have economic power as well because they control the food supply. Not just because they're the farmers, but also the men will bring home deer and the women process the meat, and then it becomes theirs to pass out and to share out. And so it's a gift economy in many ways. The prestige is coming not from how much you have, but how much do you share. And so that's that collective communal nature is very marked for the matricultures. Now, we have to note that patriarchy is a historical process, and it's a series of overlays that accumulate over time, and it doesn't always happen the same way. So in this part of the world, you may have women secluded and discouraged or even prevented from going out in public or being forced to completely cover their bodies. But they may also be businesswomen who run businesses using male agents. In this place over here, you have women who can come and go freely, but who undergo female genital excision as a way of attempting to enforce female sexual fidelity, and to uphold a patriarchal system in that way. But in other societies, you may have patrilineal descent enforced and male authority enforced, but you still have a female sphere of power in the spiritual realm. And this is where you get into the priestesses and the medicine women, and that's something that's important, because a lot of times when women have been trying for the last 50 years to really think about, longer than that clearly, but especially in this last wave of the women's movement, to think about how do we wind up in this position, and how did all these things happen? How do we come into such a severely male-dominated society, where women are controlled on all these cultural levels, aside from their own personal strength. There are all these levers being pulled that actually teach them to police themselves, that God disapproves of them if they should assert themselves, if they should have boundaries or whatever it is, express their sexuality. So how that happens varies a lot. Even when it does happen, you will sometimes see a very mixed picture. You will see matricultural elements in a culture that's patriarchal. And that Greece is a really great example of that in ancient times. You have women as the priestesses in the temples of the goddesses. And that was still a female sphere of power, even though Greece had become a highly patriarchal culture by that time. But you have an area that women still control. They have authority over that. And then you have pressures brought to bear on that, which culminate after in the late Roman Empire, you have the banning of priestesses, under the Christian church. But that process even began before Christianity. In ancient Rome, for example, the most powerful priesthoods, including those of many of the goddesses, were arrogated to men. And so you have this encroachment of male power over female power and female boundaries and female concerns that predates Christianity. But with the all-male Christian priesthood, you really see it take a whole other level, because now everything that is authoritative, what is doctrine, which literally means teaching, right, has to be expressed by men and only by men. Women can repeat it, but they cannot originate it. They cannot become authorities in their own right. And so this is really damaging, and this becomes the basis again for persecution of witches, because it was considered, and still is by Orthodox Catholics now, completely illegitimate and even blasphemous, certainly heretical, for women to presume to ever lead in ceremony or to baptize or to say a funeral ceremony. That is all entirely nonsense. And look what they've done with it. We've got these, because it corrupts that kind of absolute power, really concentrated in the hands of a long-standing brotherhood with all of the sexual secrets that have been kept, and all of the misuse of the confessional and other spheres of priestly authority to rape and to abuse. So we're seeing the Catholic Church, it's just being ripped open. This is a different kind of wound. This is a really basic wound that's being torn open, because all of these survivors have been living for decades with the memory of what was done to them, and suddenly, well, not suddenly, but things have come to a point where the revelations reach a critical mass and can be heard, even to the point where now the Pope is going to have to be forced to answer to those wounds, to the wounded, and it's like, okay, you've been moving priestly rapists around the map, and secretly, without telling the new congregation, okay, we'll move him over here. We'll send him to a little 6-week treatment program at some monastery and admonish him, but then he's back at it. And sometimes we're finding out there were even networks of priests who marked their victims. They would give them necklaces of crosses, and then the boy that was wearing that cross could be known by other priests. He's one. Try him. You can get away with it with him. It worked for me, And of course, girls being abused as well. I think sometimes a lot of the outrage is precisely because boys were victimized. Because what happened, girls and women, adult women, also being sexually predated on by priests. So anyway, that's a very far way from mother right and mother law.
That's a great transition, actually. If you can even just speak a little bit to how are you seeing the witch wound still present and active? You named what's happening in the Catholic Church as one element of how it's still present. And I'm curious how it's present, not, for all genders, for all races, everybody. How does it show up? Kind of what are the main key markers, so to speak?
Well, I think shaming is a big thing. Name calling, verbal abuse, marking as other in order to attack. I think there's a really large element of silencing that goes on. We're seeing a lot of this going on with women, intimidation and bullying and silencing. And that's just such an old pattern, but we're seeing a revival of it. It's part of a backlash. There is the absolute othering, if we look along the racialized axis of people who are either descendants of those who were conquered and colonized, or those who were transported into a slave caste system, and them being blamed for the conditions, for the aftermath, for the outcome of the oppression that their ancestors suffered. They're being blamed for the trauma, for the visible effects of the trauma, and they're being disbelieved. It's been very interesting to watch how the cell phone camera has really made visible what's been going on all along: abuse by police, rape in prison cells. Well, that's not being caught on cell phone camera, but there are ways in which the killings of Black people, especially Black men, but certainly Black women too, but also Latinx, people of Mexican descent, people of Native descent, these forms of violence, the abduction of Native women, the trafficking of Indigenous women into the man camps. There's money to be made, and so it's an extension of a colonial and a capitalist mindset where, these humans can be treated as natural resources to create wealth for others, and just basically wrung out and then thrown away. Those are really deep wounds, and we, in that context too, the wound to the land. Because what we saw with Idle No More, the Canadian Native women-founded movement that started back some time ago, and then later on Sacred Stone Camp and the whole attempt to stop the DACA pipeline in Dakota, both women-founded movements that were in defense of Mother Earth against resource extraction, you know, and the tar sands up in Canada, this massive Mordor-like smokestack-filled world of extracting oil from these sands in Alberta, Canada, and then sending that oil, which leaves a huge impact. It hurts the water table, it hurts everything. And so the Native women said, no, we don't want these pipelines to send this oil out so it can be exported out on the international market. You're hurting the earth. We have to protect the water. And so those oil pipelines were involved in both of those cases. But it was really, you know, the way that they refocused it was water is life. What's the most important thing? You know, and this is prophecy. It is modern day prophecy in our technological world, because prophecy isn't predicting the future, although they are predicting that, you know, the harm of what is happening and will continue if we don't stop that. But prophecy in its old sense, like even in the biblical sense, in the Greek word, was referred to revealing truth, you know, and speaking to what is what is uppermost in importance, you know, among humans, what needs to happen, what needs to change. It's a message of spiritual integrity that needs to be heard. And so I see that as prophecy with those women. And their defense of the land is completely integrated with the defense of their peoples and that of the women who are being murdered at rates that are greater than any other group, you know, trafficked and murdered. So, and this is something that's been disregarded. I mean, I think for us, prophecy also means standing up and signal boosting those voices and saying, we have to pay attention. These are atrocities that have to be ended, you know, and that really speaks to how do we heal that witch wound? You know, how do we heal that wound to ourselves as animals living on earth? You know, spiritual animals, beings that are dealing with diseased culture that causes all these wounds to be inflicted on the whole web of life. How do we heal that? We have to, it all goes together. I mean, that's why I say everything counts. All of these oppressions, all of these harms and forms of violence count, you know, and they're all related. Even though we're looking across several different axes of oppression, those oppressions are intertwined, you know, and so that is, it's difficult to look at what's happening now and to know. I mean, we're bewildered. What do we do? You know, and we're all under intense pressure as we're watching all this happen. And how are we going to unite this very, very divided humanity and ensure that justice happens so that that wound can heal and that other wounds will be prevented from ever being inflicted?
Yeah, so beautifully stated, Max. There's a kind of the ethos that I want to string through this course is also, you know, the as within, so without. And I'm wondering if you can speak, just as we're kind of winding down here, you know, what might you recommend our students start with as a place to begin to tend their own witch wound so that they can show up collectively to tend our collective witch wounds?
Well, I think we have to look at women, because this is really sort of a nexus around which so many forms of oppression have been organized. I mean, there's no capitalism without patriarchy. There's no empire without capital. You know, there all these things, there's layers. And so we have to really ensure justice for women. And that addresses a huge, huge freight of violence that's going on. You know, we have to look at the colonial context of the world we live in, you know, and we have to have restorative justice for that. The wounds of racism and the way that people are unconscious about how that harms everything. I think that listening to the voices of people who are targeted, it's like, I really recommend people look into the Sacred Stone Camp, some of the teachings that are coming out there. There's a woman named Sherry Mitchell, who has a book called Sacred Instructions. And we need to start looking at and learning from what the indigenous teachings are around decolonization, because it does speak very much to those of us of European descent also, both in terms of what we need to be responsible for, accountable for, but also for our own understanding of what we've lost, and our own attempt to recover so that we have our own authentic place to stand, our ancestral roots. This is what Arvel Looking Horse, one of the elders at the Seven Fires camp in Dakota to stop the pipeline, was telling these young Euro-American seekers, or whatever age, but people who were clearly really hungry for spiritual guidance, and who were in some cases trying to copy Dakota ways or some other indigenous ways. And he's saying, go find your ancestral roots. This is part of what you need to do. And I believe that. That's why I've spent, it's close to 50 years now, trying to document what those were, to really have some understanding, because, and by learning from indigenous people talking about their own culture, it illuminates so many things of what I've found, from these remnants, from these ripped shreds of culture out of the European heritages. You begin to see there are commonalities with the whole rest of the planet, in the ways of healing, and the use of sacred smoking, the use of water and fire, chanting into the body of a sick person, the use of invocation, the gestures that are used, the ways of ecstasy, the praying with the body. That these are things that we in European descended culture are terrified of these things, because they are literally cast as madness. That's crazy. To ecstasy means being beside yourself, being outside of yourself. It's like you are within a larger whole. You're in touch with the spiritual web. And that is terrifying, because it's not under the control of the Western white male mind. It is the all, and anything can come through. And so they spent so much energy policing that. They've been very effective at it, because we now police ourselves, and we're fearful. So I watch women being afraid to dance because their bodies are so contested. Our ability to inhabit our own bodies has been contested since we came out of the womb. It's just like we've been bombarded, and especially in this media culture, with these intense messages that are saying, you're wrong in every way. You're never acceptable as who you are. Your authentic perceptions and sensations, you're made to doubt them at every level. So we have a lot of unlearning to do. But the thing about that is that there are incredible gifts and treasures that can be unveiled once we begin that process of that unlearning, all those toxic scripts. Then we begin to see who we really are, and we begin to free ourselves. It's like we're bound, we're constrained, and we have to burst out of those constraints, that were laid by oppression on the basis of sex, on the basis of racialized caste, on class, religious doctrine, gender codes. Be who you are. Be free to be who you are. And be careful not to afflict others with that which has wounded you. Don't persecute. Look at that. Look at how that's done. Look at how we need to grow out of that. I just think that, it's like ecstatic dance and chant, land walking, opening ourselves, clearing ourselves. It's like you have to release before the nectar can really flow in. It's like there's that famous Buddhist thing, you know, the teacher, the student holds out his cup and the teacher is pouring, and he continues pouring and the cup is overflowing, and the student's like, what are you doing? And the teacher says, look, I can't put anything in because the cup is too full. It's too full of your preconceptions and assumptions and judged notions. So in order for us to really clarify, even before you can heal, we have to clarify, we have to release, we have to clear out, and then the nature can teach us everything. Even with all the destruction of our ancestral ways, where did they get it? They got it from the source, you know, and we can regrow. It's really, culture means that which is grown, which is cultivated, that which is tended. So we are at the phase where we really need, there's all these ways in which people are trying to recast and create liberatory culture. So that's where we're going, and that's a promise. That's a good thing. That's something to look forward to. We have to watch out for fear and for that repressive impulse, because I'm seeing a lot of it now. And stay in harmony, and don't react off the cuff. Don't go into rages. I mean, this summer was so full of so many rages, people going into frenzies. And it's like, wait, you know, expand a little bit and consider before just reacting. And all the hard experiences are our teachers. They're painful. I don't know why, but that's how life is, I guess. You know, is we have to transform ourselves in order to master the challenges that we're subjected to.
Oh, Max, you are hitting it out of the park today. You're giving me and the students just so much to think about. And I want to encourage all the students to go to your website, get your book, follow you and support you. And I just want to turn it over for you just to, how can the students connect with you? What else do you have coming up that you want us to know about? This is your opportunity to plug yourself.
Yeah, okay. Well, first you should know my website is Suppressed Histories, that's with an IES, Suppressed Histories plural, .net, not .com. So on there you'll find links for most of the other stuff. I don't have it all updated yet because I'm adding all this new material. So there's a new podcast called History Sybil, and that's audio commentaries, because I realized, you know, I have 15 more volumes sitting in the file drawer. I don't know how long it's going to take to get those out, but too long, you know? And so I just decided to start doing chapters, just selecting sections from it, because it covers everything from, you know, the late Bronze Age all the way up to now, as far as how patriarchal authoritarian culture has developed within the European sphere. I'm just sticking with that pretty much for this story. But so I'm doing the audio podcasts. And then I also have a blog, which is called Valletta. So if you Google Max Dashu Valletta, you'll probably come up with my book publishing company first, but there is a blog. You can find a link to that on the Suppressed Histories site. And then there's my art site, which I don't know if you've seen actually, Portia, yes. maxdashu.net. And I'm in the process of reconfiguring that. Not everything is up there, but there's certainly plenty to explore there of my prints, posters, and there's a couple scrolls on there. I'm going to be adding maps. You know, our ability to envision cultural worlds, we need maps. It's just, we have to put this all in a real concrete context. And so you can explore around on the Suppressed Histories website. But the last thing I wanted to mention is that, well, not the last thing, and I have a Patreon account. So patreon.com/maxdashu, no C in Dashu. You just Google Max Dashu Patreon, you'll find it. And but the last thing I wanted to say is that this October, I'll be doing this research and documentation of global women's culture for 49 years. And so we're having a celebration in Berkeley, California, on October 27th, which if you're in that area, you can, find out more about it. I'll be putting it on the events page of my website very soon, in fact, tonight. But I'm going to be talking about the history of the archives and giving just a very concentrated view of all the visual talks that have come to being over the since 1973. And we're going to have musicians, drummers, people are going to talk about the archives. And so it's going to be fun. It's kind of like a milestone because it's 7 times 7 years.
Congratulations, Max. I mean, this is your life's work, your canon, and I feel like the ripple effect of everything that you've gathered in this reclamation process is going to, I mean, the impact is going to ripple out way beyond what you could even imagine. That's my hope, is that your work just lives on and expands and is just so pivotal to help what I see as the rising, kind of the return of the witches in a way. I feel like there is, we're coming back, there's that meme that goes around, we're the granddaughters of the witches that you didn't burn. And I feel like I was a witch that got burned. And I'm back now.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting how diffuse that understanding is, because even my, not really particularly feminist neighbor when I was growing up, the neighbor lady told me, later when I was an adult, she said, well, I would have been burned as a witch. I mean, it's like women, this is like the metaphor for how they keep us down. And it's also the metaphor for our power, the power of our speech, of our, everything is sacred in us. And so that return that you're talking about is happening. It's a bumpy ride. Starhawk had said it recently, it's a heavy lift. But the alternative is unthinkable. I mean, it's just like, it has to be done. And I think there are very great rewards for the colossal amount of work that we have to do to bring this about. But it's not just work, it's also artistic expression. It's dance, it's music, it's culture making, all the beautiful art that women are creating. And so that is not to be forgotten, that we are more, we can be more than who they told us we had to be.
I feel like that's just a beautiful note to end our official time for the students. And so I'm going to say thank you very much, Max, for joining us today. And I'll push the stop record button and then I'll give you another official goodbye.
Okay. Thank you, Portia, for inviting me.